I want to be clear. I am against Joe Biden withholding certain weapons in this circumstance. But I think principally, I am okay with the president having discretion on something like this. To me, I feel like it would fit into the checks and balances category, the checks and balance bucket, where the Congress appropriates money or weapons, and the president has some discretion on how that may best be doled out, or in this case, not doled out. I think, so you with me? I'm against Biden doing it here, but I'm okay with the principle of it. I think, let's go to our Breitbart Senior Legal Analyst, Ken Klukowski, who doesn't care what I feel. We're going to talk about the law. Ken, how you doing?
Well,
man?
good morning. Good morning, Mike. And you know, it's not that your feelings are unimportant, but you know, when you're running a country, what's important is what are we thinking, not what are we feeling. That's what that's what the things we teach children. You know, it's when you're an adult, you have to actually think through things, and sometimes, you know, you might not. You can't just avoid the things where you feel a pit in your stomach, and you can't do whatever, you know, gives you a rush of happiness. You know, that life is full of all sorts of decisions where your mind might not match up to your mood at the moment.
How dare you tell me that my feelings don't matter, Ken?
I know. If we were to raise our children and tell them to just follow their feelings and not think about things themselves, then they turn out to be liberals.
The worst thing of all. All right, so what are the legal? First of all, is my principle somewhat sound that that the Congress does a thing and the president has some discretion in doing the thing?
Well, I think we have to redefine it. We have to frame the question differently. It's the way you have it framed there. It's hard to know whether the yes or the no would be correct. Before 1974. Ever since Thomas Jefferson until Nixon, presidents routinely declined to spend funds that Congress had appropriated. And we saw this a lot with Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, JFK. So in the Cold War presidents, before Nixon, there were whole aircraft programs where, you know, the sitting president was like, no, we really don't need that many of that type of airplane. I'm not going to spend that money on it. Mm-hmm. We had that go on with Navy ships. I mean, we're talking about some real big ticket items here where the president said, yeah, I'm commander in chief, and you know, we don't need to be spending those truckloads of money on this thing, notwithstanding that Congress had appropriated funds for it. And then Nixon had done the same thing. And but during the days, of course, when Nixon was on the ropes, Democrats had a solid majority in both houses of Congress. They enacted the Impoundment Control Act, or the ICA. And the ICA essentially makes it mandatory to waste taxpayer money. The ICA says that if Congress appropriates it, it creates budget authority. And for any given appropriation, it also specifies the period of obligation. That's the window where the funds can be spent, or it can include language to say that these funds are available until it's obligated, meaning that they'll never expire. You know, the money's going to sit there until you spend it. Most things expire out of after one fiscal year, but there are some of these permanent items, like I just described, and they say. Unless the only way under the ICA you cannot spend this money is if you can pause it for up to 45 days as you're putting together a rescission package, put together a list of items that you formally send back to Congress and say, hey, we don't need this. You know, you gave us all sorts of money, and all we can do now is spend it on champagne and lobsters, and we don't think that's a good use of money before it expires. So here you go. And you can go ahead and claw back the money if you want, but that if you don't send a rescission package, that it becomes what's called an impoundment, which they say is illegal. The Impoundment Control Act is a terribly wrong-headed law because it makes it mandatory. You are violating the law if you don't spend every dollar of this money. Now, the reality is this. There's also a federal crime you violate if you spend even $1 more than you have. That's called the Anti-Deficiency Act. And that's the big one, because the Constitution says that no money can be spent unless it's been appropriated by Congress. And so if you go $1 beyond what Congress has spent, now you're in trouble. You're actually violating the Constitution. And the ADA, as it's called for short, if you are doing it willfully, if you're willfully spending money that Congress did not appropriate, that's actually a crime. You can go to prison for that. So it's like, hang on a second. If you're talking about multiple trillions of dollars in federal spending, much of which is debt that we're borrowing from China, but nonetheless, if you're talking about numbers that big, how is it mathematically possible to not be $1 under or $1 over? And the reality is that all the time, especially since a lot of these things involve interest, and so the interest is racking up literally every single second. Like when you're talking about, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars or billions, every second that the amount of interest owed on certain things can be increasing. The reality is that mathematically you cannot. And so you always come in slightly under because, again, it can be a crime if you go even slightly over. So everyone's always coming in slightly under. And all of that is just brushed aside as, oh, no big deal. I mean, they tried to spend every penny, so we're okay. Not only that, let me even make it crazier. Often members of Congress will be calling the White House and saying, hey, can you pause on this particular aspect? I'm not sure this is right in my district or whatnot. And the OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, which is the operations center of the White House, and among other things, controls the release of funds once they've been appropriated. That's called apportionment authority. That happens all the time. And Congress never squawks about that because it's done at their request. It's done at the request of committees or committee chairmen or even individual members. It's just part of, how taxpayer money is spent on different things. No one has any problem about it until it involves something involving Donald Trump or Israel or certain, hot-button topics, and then they scream bloody murder and they're clutching their pearls about how, oh, no, the law, So I've had to lay all this out because that frames the question that we started with in this regard. The ICA needs to be reformed. And, in fact, check this out. You want to hear something crazy? Is ever since a Republican-controlled Congress passed a law in the 1990s saying that the U.S. Embassy in Israel would be moved from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, first of all, it said that presidents could delay it for 6 months if it was in the national security interest. Starting with Clinton, everyone did that. Every 6 months, signed a waiver, not moving the embassy. But Congress also at various times, when they passed the appropriations law for each year for the State Department, would specify that not less than like $1.5 million or not less than $5 million of this shall be spent in constructing an embassy in Jerusalem and moving the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So you had this mandatory spending from Congress. And presidents from both parties would look at it and say, yeah, I'm just not going to do that. And there the president would claim the constitutional right to do so. He'd say, look, under the Constitution, only I can recognize a foreign country. That includes being able to recognize what city is the capital of that country, putting my embassy there. It's saying that this is the capital. So, the Constitution allows me, notwithstanding that you're saying spend these millions of dollars on an embassy, I'm not going to do it, and the Constitution can't make me do it. It wasn't until you got to Donald Trump, who's like, heck yeah, we're moving it, and recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, went ahead and moved everything. So all of that comes into this moment that you would swear it's so unprecedented what's going on here, right? And once again, it is a Trump versus Biden comparison because the Democrats impeached Trump for not spending Ukraine aid for less than 2 months. And this is where we come full circle, and then you can tell me whether this answers your question, is that with Ukraine, Congress passed a law that said that by the end of the fiscal year, so by September 30, you had to give X amount of money to Ukraine. There was a brand new president there. Ukraine is notorious for corruption, horrible, horrible corruption there. By the way, anyone know that the president's son, Hunter Biden, got put on a board of an energy company there? Yeah. Anyways, separate topic. But but horrible corruption problems there, and the president, that under the president, OMB was doing a programmatic reassessment in terms of, okay, what are we spending the money on there? And there was this new president. President Trump wanted to have a conversation with this guy to size him up. Democrats didn't just say it was illegal. They actually, that was the first impeachment of President Trump. They're like, wait a second, you can't do that. Now, all the money was actually released by September 30. There was no deadline on the money. They just said it was an unreasonable delay. And on that basis, they impeached him and tried to remove him from office. Of course, that failed.
Did they cite the Impoundment? Did they cite the Impoundment Control Act of 1974?
Yes, they said they were impeaching him for violating the Impoundment Control Act.
No way. I thought the emphasis was more on
impeachment of Donald Trump. In case the listeners were wondering, why are we getting a lecture on the ICA? Because that's what they impeached Donald Trump over. All right, and when what OMB was doing there was standard practice in terms of, because the law explicitly says that you can make decisions regarding the efficiency of how the funds are being spent. And so OMB, things were paused for less than 2 months to determine, in this very corrupt country, but now one that had a new president, to determine what of this huge pot of money, what parts are we given to be spent on what items? What exactly are we giving them here? Is this the best use of taxpayer money? Because, again, it's a regime where a lot of money ends up in certain people's pockets, okay, which obviously is an abuse of taxpayer money. So standard stewardship was going on in terms of taxpayer funds under Trump, and they got impeached with it. Now you come to Joe Biden. They leveraged this Israel aid to pass Ukraine aid. So ironically, Ukraine comes back in a second time. But here they go, and they say, no, Israel is under attack right now. We need to pass this right now. This was an annual appropriations. This was nothing with a 1-year period of obligation to spend the money. All of us in the news business or even watching the news know that the White House was saying, no, every day that passes, Israelis could die. They need this money right now. They can't even wait 5 minutes. You know, if you're eating dinner, don't eat your dinner. Leave dinner. Go to the floor in Congress. Pass this now. Every second matters. And so they get the Israel aid, they bundle it with the Ukraine aid, and all this other stuff that they wanted. It's passed. Now, I think that was a mistake. It should have been standalone Israel aid, but, that's a topic for another day. They passed this package, and then when it is passed as an emergency measure for immediate emergency military needs in Israel, and that's why Congress was doing it, and Congress was explicit that that's why they were doing it. Now Joe Biden is withholding that aid to Israel, and that is definitely illegal.